Story 1. The Man Who Stood in the Driveway. It started on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind where the sun slips behind the ridge before you're ready, and the air smells of damp leaves and wood smoke. I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing coffee cups, when I glanced out the window toward the end of my gravel drive. There he was, just a dark figure standing still, half in shadow, where the last of the daylight caught the dust in the air. He didn't move, didn't wave. He was too far off to make out much detail, just the shape of a man with his hands in his pockets, facing my house. I stood there a while, waiting for him to step forward or turn away, but he never did. Eventually, I pulled the curtain and told myself maybe he was lost, maybe just looking for the main road. 2 nights later, he was back. Same place, same posture, no car, no flashlight, just there. The night was cooler, the wind carrying that brittle rustle through the trees, and I could almost hear the faint crunch of gravel under his boots, though he wasn't moving. I watched him from behind the curtain until my eyes blurred. Around 10 o'clock, I looked again, and he was gone. I didn't see him leave. Weeks passed. Sometimes he'd be there 3 nights in a row, sometimes not for a week. I tried to ignore it, but small things began to unsettle me. A muddy boot print on my porch one morning, though I hadn't been outside the night before. A cigarette butt in the grass by my bedroom window. Once, just as I was drifting off, I heard the slow, deliberate sound of gravel shifting, like weight shifting from one foot to the other, somewhere near my front steps. I told the sheriff. He drove out, gave the woods a half-hearted sweep with his flashlight, and told me it was probably just a drifter cutting through the area. Happens every fall, he said, like the seasons brought more than just deer hunters and frost. One night, I decided I'd had enough. When I saw him at the end of the drive, I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and the old 22 my father left me. The cold air hit my face as I walked down, each crunch of gravel under my boots too loud in the stillness. My light bounced off tree trunks and the glint of ice on the ditch. By the time I reached the road, my breath hanging in white puffs, the drive was empty. The space where he had been was nothing but open night and the smell of wet earth. No sound, no movement. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. After that, he didn't show for a while, but the feeling didn't leave. I'd wake to find my gate unlatched, though I'd locked it the night before. One morning, I noticed a line of scuffed dirt along the side of my shed, as if someone had been leaning there, waiting. The first snow came early that year, thick, wet flakes that coated the yard and muffled the world. I stepped out to shovel the porch and saw them, footprints. They didn't come from the road, they came from the woods, straight to the corner of my house, then over to my bedroom window, and finally down the drive to the spot where I'd first seen him standing. The tracks stopped there, as if he'd stepped into the air and vanished. That night, I kept the lights low and sat in my armchair by the front window. The moon lit the snow in a pale glow, and the woods were dark beyond it. Around midnight, I caught a flicker of movement near the tree line. A shadow stepping forward, slow and sure, each step leaving a black mark in the snow. My hands went cold. He walked until he stood exactly where he always had, at the edge of the drive. Even at that distance, I could tell he was watching the house. I gripped the armrests and waited for him to move, to do anything. He didn't. Minutes passed. My breath fogged the glass, and the ticking of the wall clock felt too loud. Finally, I blinked, and he was gone, just gone. But the snow at his feet remained disturbed, the prints still pressed deep. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I went out to look. The prints from the woods were clear, but there were no return tracks, just the single path in. I followed them back toward the tree line, the cold biting through my coat. They led me 20 yards into the woods, then stopped beside a deadfall. Beyond that, The snow was perfect and untouched, as if no one had been there. The days grew shorter, and I tried to convince myself I'd imagined more than I'd really seen, but the visits became more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear a faint knock on the far side of the house. 3 slow taps, space just enough to make you wonder if you'd imagined it. Other times the phone would ring once, then stop, the line dead when I picked it up. One evening a storm rolled in and the wind howled down the ridge. I sat in the dark, listening to the branches scrape the roof. A sharp sound cut through the noise, gravel shifting. I crept to the window. Through the blowing snow I saw him again, but this time he was closer, maybe halfway up the drive. He wasn't moving toward the house, just standing there, his head tilted like he was listening for something inside. I stepped back from the glass, my heart thudding. When I looked again, he was gone, the spot empty but for the swirling snow. I started sleeping in the back room, away from the windows. But even there, I'd wake to a prickling on my skin, the sense that something was just beyond the walls. One morning, I found the back door's lock turned to the open position, though I hadn't touched it in days. The last time I saw him was late in January. The moon was bright, the snow deep and crusted. I'd just stepped onto the porch to bring in some firewood when I caught movement at the bottom of the drive. He was there, exactly as before, still, silent, watching. But now I could see more detail, a pale face, eyes too dark to catch the moonlight, and a coat that looked soaked through, the fabric stiff and heavy. I froze, the cold seeping into my bones, and for the first time I realized he'd never once come from the road. His posture shifted slightly, and then he turned, not back toward the trees, but toward the hollow that ran behind my property. Without a sound, he walked into the dark, the snow swallowing his steps. The next morning, I followed his trail. It led behind the house, down into the hollow, and stopped at a spot where the snow was disturbed in a wide, shallow depression. Beneath it, the ground was bare and damp, as if the earth there had been recently opened. I haven't seen him since, but I keep the curtains drawn tight and the locks checked twice before bed. Sometimes, though, when the wind dies and the night is still, I think I hear the faint crunch of gravel at the end of the drive, and I know he could be standing there, waiting. Story 2. The house across the hollow. The McClary place had been nothing more than part of the scenery for as long as I could remember. Grey boards weathered thin, a sagging porch, and windows clouded with dust. The hollow between my property and theirs was deep enough that the house seemed swallowed by it, especially in winter when the sun barely touched the far slope. Folks in town said it had been empty since the last McClary passed on, and judging by the way the weeds had overtaken the yard, I believed them. I'd walked past it dozens of times in daylight without giving it much thought, but I'd never once gone near it after dark. Then, in the heart of winter, I started noticing the light. The first time I thought I'd imagined it. I was on my porch, cold seeping into my bones, looking across the hollow at the black outline of that house, when a faint flicker caught my eye, upstairs, rightmost window. It wasn't a steady glow, more like the wavering light of a lantern moving back and forth. It came for a few seconds, then went dark. I figured maybe it was a hunter or someone cutting through the area, but it was too late in the night for that, and too far from the road. A week later, I saw it again, this time at 3 a.m. when I got up for a glass of water, just the faint glow pacing back and forth, slow and deliberate. Then nothing for days. It didn't make sense. If someone was squatting there, why only light a lantern for a few minutes at a time? It was about then that my dog, Jasper, started acting strange. Whenever we walked the lower trail that skirted the hollow, he'd pull hard on the leash, trying to keep away from that side. His ears would lay flat, tail low, and he'd glance toward the house like he expected something to come out of it. One afternoon, he stopped dead, hackles up, staring at the empty window where I'd seen the light. I saw nothing but glass and shadow, but his growl was low and steady until I turned us back toward home. It was that unease, mixed with curiosity, that finally made me decide to see for myself. One evening in late January, snow began falling, the kind that comes down soft and heavy, muffling everything. By the time the sky went black, the hollow was buried under a fresh layer, unbroken and clean. That was the night I told myself I'd go over there. I waited until after midnight, when the air was still and cold enough to bite the inside of my nose. Jasper stayed home. He'd have refused to go anyway. I put on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and started down the trail that wound into the hollow. The snow crunched under my feet, each step sounding louder than it should in the quiet. By the time I reached the bottom, I could see the house more clearly, its dark bulk rising out of the snow, the upstairs window faintly reflecting the moon. The closer I got, the more I felt that stillness settle over me. Not the normal winter silence, but a deeper kind, like the air was holding something in. I climbed the far slope slowly, my breath coming in plumes. The fence line was half buried, its posts leaning, wire sagging. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the snow but not leading toward the door. Instead, they formed a path that circled the house over and over, each loop perfect, like someone had been walking it for hours. I shined my light across them, following the loops around one side, then the other. There were no tracks leading in from the road or the woods, just the circle, endless and precise. I stood there a long moment, trying to figure it out. My breath was loud in my ears, the cold sinking into my gloves. Then, without warning, the upstairs light came on. It was faint, yellow, flickering like a lantern. It moved slowly from one side of the room to the other, pausing, then drifting back. I froze, my light hanging limp at my side. Whoever it was hadn't turned it on because of me. They'd done it while I was standing there, watching. The hollow seemed to grow heavier, the air pressing in. I became acutely aware of how far I was from my house, how deep the snow was around my boots. My flashlight beam wavered, catching the frost clinging to the porch rail, the warped boards of the front steps. Then, just as suddenly, the light went out. I didn't hear a sound. No footsteps, no creak of floorboards, just the quiet settling back in, thicker than before. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Slowly, I backed toward the fence, keeping my eyes on that window. The snow crunched under my boots, and I winced at how loud it sounded. By the time I reached the hollow's edge, the house was nothing but a dark shape against darker trees. I climbed back down, half expecting to see new footprints behind me. None appeared, but the feeling that I was being watched didn't leave. For the next week, I avoided looking across the hollow at night. But one morning, just before dawn, I caught movement from my bedroom window, that faint flicker again, sliding past the upstairs glass. This time, I stayed where I was, watching from the warmth of my room. The light stopped, as if it had turned to face me directly. Even from that distance, I felt the weight of it. I told myself to forget it, that it was none of my business. But the unease worked on me, kept me glancing toward the hollow whenever I stepped outside. Then, 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of Jasper whining at the foot of the bed. His ears were perked toward the window, his body rigid. I followed his gaze and saw the light again. Not in the upstairs window this time, but downstairs, low to the ground. It swayed gently, as if whoever held it was moving through the front room. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the snow just inside my property line, coming from the direction of the hollow. They stopped under the cedar tree near the edge of my yard, where the snow was scuffed in a tight circle like someone had stood there for a long time, shifting their weight. After that, the light came more often, sometimes upstairs, sometimes down. Once, I thought I saw a shadow cross in front of it, tall, narrow, and deliberate. I never saw it leave the window. One night in February, I heard something new, the faintest sound of footsteps on snow coming from the hollow. I sat in the dark, listening as they drew closer, slow and steady, then stopped. I couldn't bring myself to look out. I don't know how long I sat there before sleep took me, but by morning, the only sign anything had happened was a single, perfect circle of footprints in the snow, far down at the base of the hollow, facing my house. I still see the light sometimes, always at odd hours, always flickering like a lantern. I've never gone back over there, and I don't plan to. But I've noticed something else in the past week. When the light moves in the upstairs window, it's no longer pacing side to side, it's facing forward, and it doesn't go out until long after I've pulled the curtains closed. Story 3. The Woman Who Never Spoke. It was early spring when I first saw her, the kind of evening where the air is warm but still carries a trace of winter's bite. I'd been walking the dirt road near my cabin, the one that runs along the ridge before dipping down toward the creek. The sun was low, painting the treetops in gold, and I was halfway lost in thought when I noticed her coming from the opposite direction. She wore a faded dress that might have been blue once, though the color had been worn to something pale and uncertain. A scarf was pulled tight over her hair, knotted under her chin. There was nothing remarkable about her at first glance, except for the way she carried herself, straight-backed, unhurried, and without so much as a glance at the road ahead. When our paths crossed, I gave a polite nod and a good evening. She didn't answer, but her lips curved into the faintest smile before she kept walking. No break in her pace, no acknowledgement beyond that. The next evening, around the same time, I saw her again. Same place, same direction, same faded dress. I thought maybe she was just a neighbor from one of the scattered houses a few miles up, but I'd never seen her at the store or in town or anywhere else. By the third night, I was expecting her. I lingered outside as the sun dipped behind the ridge, pretending to check the fence line until I spotted her in the distance. Her steps were slow but steady, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond me. This time, I didn't say anything. She passed without even that small smile. It went on like that for the better part of a week. Always the same stretch of road, always just before sundown, always heading in the same direction. I started to time my walks to match hers, a quiet routine I couldn't explain even to myself. On the 7th evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided I'd follow her, just far enough to see where she was going. I kept my distance, careful not to let my boots scuff too loud against the gravel. She never looked back. We walked nearly 2 miles before she turned down a narrow path I'd never noticed before. It was overgrown, half swallowed by briars and saplings, but her pace never slowed. I followed, brushing branches from my face, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The path wound deeper into the trees until it ended abruptly in a small clearing. There was nothing there but a tangle of weeds and the remnants of a rotted fence. She stepped into the clearing, and for a moment the sunlight caught the edge of her scarf. I blinked, and she was gone. I don't mean she slipped into the trees or vanished into the shadows. She was just gone. One moment she was in front of me, and the next there was only empty space. The dirt where she'd walked was soft from the recent rain, but when I looked down there were no footprints. Not hers, not mine. The ground was smooth, as if no one had been there at all. I stood in that clearing longer than I cared to admit, the quiet pressing in on me until the air felt heavy in my chest. When I finally turned back, the path behind me seemed narrower, darker than it had on the way in. That night, I mentioned it to my nearest neighbor, an old man named Wilkes, who'd lived on the ridge all his life. He listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing just slightly. When I finished, he nodded once and said, "There used to be folks back that way. McCready family. House burned down in 72. All of them gone in one night. Nobody rebuilt." I asked if he'd ever seen a woman on the road. He shook his head. "Best keep to your own path," he said. And that was the end of it. I told myself I wouldn't look for her again, but I did. 2 nights later, there she was. Same dress, same scarf, same slow, steady pace. This time, the smile was gone. Her face was expressionless, her eyes fixed ahead. I tried to convince myself she was just some woman who liked walking the ridge at dusk, but small things began to gnaw at me. She never appeared at any other time of day. Her clothes never changed, never shifted in the breeze, and though I strained to hear it, I never caught the sound of her footsteps on the gravel. One evening, I stayed hidden behind the corner of my shed as she passed. She moved exactly as before, but as she drew level with me, she slowed, just slightly, as if she knew I was there. Her head didn't turn, but I felt the weight of her awareness, like a hand pressing against my back. After she passed, I stepped out to watch her go. She walked until she was just a shape against the dimming light, then vanished into the bend of the road. The next day, I went back to that overgrown path in daylight. The briars were thicker than I remembered, and the clearing beyond seemed smaller, almost claustrophobic. I searched for any sign of the McCready house, but there was nothing. No foundation stones, no charred beams. Only the faint outline of what might have been a well, half filled with leaves. Standing there, I felt that same heaviness in the air, the same stillness that made the hairs on my arms rise. It was as if the clearing was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, I stayed inside, curtains drawn, but just before sundown, Jasper, my old hound, lifted his head from the hearth and let out a low whine. I froze, listening. Somewhere outside, faint but steady, came the sound of footsteps on gravel. I moved to the window and peeled back the curtain. She was there, walking past my gate. But this time she stopped. Slowly, she turned her head toward the house. Her eyes found mine through the glass, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, the faint, almost polite curve of lips I'd seen the first night, and kept walking. I didn't follow. Since then, I've seen her only a handful of times, always just before sundown, always heading in that same direction. I've stopped trying to make sense of it. There's a weight to her presence, something that feels older than the road, older than the trees along it. But sometimes, when the evening light turns the ridge gold and the air is still, I find myself standing at my gate, watching for the first flicker of her dress among the trees. And every time I see her, I wonder if she's walking towards something, or away from it. Story 4. The Locked Door in His Barn. Earl lived about a quarter-mile down the road from me, far enough that we could go weeks without crossing paths, but close enough that I could see the red peak of his barn roof through the trees if I stood on my back porch. He was one of those men who could vanish into the rhythm of the land. Quiet, self-reliant, hard to read. Folks in town liked him well enough, but he wasn't the type to linger in conversation. I'd known him going on 8 years and could count the number of times he'd come onto my property on one hand. His barn was the only thing about him that ever seemed off. A big, weathered thing, older than either of us, with grey boards gone soft at the edges and a tin roof patched in places with whatever scrap metal was handy. It was always locked tight. No hay bales stacked outside, no tractors pulled out for the season, no tools leaning against the walls, just locked doors and shuttered windows. Once, after a storm knocked down some trees, I'd offered to let him use my chainsaw. He declined, said he had his own, though I'd never seen him carry so much as a hammer. The barn stayed shut, even when he was working on something out back. You got the feeling it was less about keeping animals out and more about keeping something in. It was late October when it happened. Earl had gone into town. Truck wasn't in the drive, no smoke from the chimney. I was walking my fence line on the side that ran closest to his property, checking for storm damage. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint, I thought it might be a woodpecker somewhere off in the trees, a steady thump, 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 spaced just enough apart to sound deliberate. But as I got closer to the barn, it changed, less like tapping, more like knocking. I slowed my steps, straining to hear. The sound wasn't frantic, but it was consistent, rhythmic. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks again. The kind of pattern that makes you think someone is trying to be heard without drawing too much attention. The air felt different near the barn, still, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I stepped up to the big double doors, paint worn away so the wood showed through. The padlock was in place, rust creeping around the edges. I put my hand against the door. The vibration was slight but undeniable. Something was moving on the other side, just enough to send a tremor through the wood. My fingertips tingled. The knocking came again, this time closer, like whoever, or whatever, was inside had moved toward me. I stood there for what felt like a long minute, my breath clouding in the cool air, my ears straining for any other sound. Then it stopped. No fading away, no shuffle of feet, just gone, as if it had never been there. The barn stood silent, the woods beyond it utterly still. I pulled my hand back, feeling the ghost of that vibration in my palm. By the time Earl's truck came rumbling up the road later that afternoon, I'd talked myself into asking him about it. We crossed paths near his porch, and I told him straight, said I'd been walking the line, heard something in his barn, wanted to be sure nothing was trapped inside. He just looked at me. Not angry, not surprised, just still. His eyes held mine longer than was comfortable, like he was weighing something. Finally, he said, "Best not to ask about things you can't keep from hearing." And that was it. He went inside, door shutting firm behind him. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the bare branches outside, every creak of the house pulling my attention. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard it again. Faint, distant, but the same 3 knocks, steady and patient. Over the next week, I kept my distance from the barn, but I started noticing things. Earl was outside less, his curtains drawn earlier in the evening. More than once, I saw a faint light flicker through the cracks in the barn boards just after sundown. It wasn't bright, just a weak, wavering glow, like a candle or a lantern. One afternoon, I passed his property on my way back from town. He wasn't home again, and I slowed my truck near the barn. The padlock was still there, but the door hung just slightly open at the bottom, no more than an inch. Enough for cold air, or something else, to slip through. That night, the knocking came back, louder than before. Not in the distance this time, but close. Close enough that I thought for a moment it might be coming from the walls of my own house. It came in 3s, always in 3s, with the same pause between. I sat in the dark, every lamp off, listening. When it finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the knocking had. 2 days later, I saw Earl in town, leaning against his truck outside the hardware store. He looked tired, hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept in days. I thought about asking him outright, but something in his expression told me the answer wouldn't be one I wanted. The first snow came early that year. I was out clearing my porch when I saw tracks cutting across the field between our properties. Not boot prints, bare feet. The toes pressed deep into the snow, each step too long for a child, too narrow for a man. They led from the barn to the fence line, then stopped, the snow beyond untouched. That night, the knocking didn't come. But just before dawn, I woke to a different sound. A low, drawn-out scrape, like something heavy being dragged across wood. I lay still, holding my breath. the sound moving slowly past the wall behind my bed. Then it was gone. When I saw Earl later that week, I asked him if he'd had trouble with trespassers. He gave me that same long, measuring look before saying, "It don't come for you unless you open the door." I didn't know if he meant the barn or something else entirely. I didn't ask. Since then, the knocking comes and goes. Sometimes months pass without it. Other times, it returns for nights in a row, steady and patient as ever. I've stopped going near the barn, even in daylight, but every now and then, when the wind dies and the snow lays thick, I'll catch a flicker of light through the trees, coming from those warped boards, and if I listen long enough, I'll hear it again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks more, like something waiting just on the other side. Story 5. The candle in the window. I'd lived on the ridge for almost 4 years before I noticed the candle. My cabin sits on the west slope, looking out across a valley where the land folds into shadow long before the sun dips. From my porch, I can see the far end of the ridge, mostly trees, but here and there, a dark roofline or the faint suggestion of a chimney. The cabin I'm talking about was one of those shapes. I never saw smoke from it, never saw a truck in the yard, and figured it was another place left to rot after its owners moved away. Then, one night, in late October, I stepped out with a mug of coffee to feel the cold creeping in. That's when I saw it. Soft light from a single candle in the front window of that far-off cabin. It burned steady, no flicker from wind or movement, just a warm pinprick in the dark. I stood there until my coffee went cold, watching it until it went out just after midnight. It became a regular thing. Almost every night, right at 10, the candle would appear. Some nights I'd watch until it went out. Other times I'd catch only the tail end of its glow. I told myself it was quaint, maybe an old-timer's habit, something their parents or grandparents had done. A few weeks passed before curiosity got the better of me. One Saturday, I decided I'd hike over and introduce myself. Maybe I'd bring pie, see if the person wanted company now and then. That night, around 9:30, I set out along the ridge trail, flashlight in hand. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that carries sound too well. My boots crunched through patches of frost, and the smell of wood smoke clung low over the trees, though it wasn't coming from anywhere nearby. By the time I reached the turnoff that led toward the cabin, it was almost 10. I could see the dark outline of the place through the trees, small, squat, the boards weathered silver by time, but the window was dark, no candle. I slowed my steps, telling myself I was early, but the stillness felt heavier than it should. Up close, the cabin looked worse than it had from a distance. The porch sagged in the middle, and the railing was gone on one side. No tire tracks, no footprints in the frost, just a few wind-scattered leaves piled against the steps. I climbed them and knocked, the sound flat and dull against the wood. No answer. I knocked again, then cupped my hands against the glass to peer inside. The room beyond was empty. Not empty like it was between tenants. Empty like it hadn't been lived in for years. Dust on the floor, no furniture, cobwebs hanging in the corners. The air felt colder at my back, and I turned, expecting to see clouds rolling in. But the ridge behind me was still. I started back the way I'd come, my breath drifting pale in the dark. When I was far enough that the cabin was just a shadow in the trees, I looked back. The candle was there. It hadn't been there when I'd stood on the porch, but now it burned in the front window. Soft orange glow against the black glass. I froze. There was something else too, just to the side of the candle, a shape darker than the rest of the room. It didn't move, but it had the outline of a person standing still, just inside. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was halfway down the trail, walking fast enough that my flashlight beam bounced over the ground. I didn't look back again until my cabin was in sight. The next night, I didn't go out on the porch. I stayed inside with the curtains drawn, but just before midnight, I peeked. The candle was burning steady as ever. I told myself I'd imagined the shadow. 2 nights later, I was woken by light spilling across my wall. I got up and looked out. The candle burned in my direction, not across the ridge but across the valley, as if it were set in a straight line between our 2 cabins. It shouldn't have been possible to see it that bright from here. I stayed inside the rest of the week, but each night the candle kept appearing at 10. Sometimes I thought I could make out that same dark shape beside it. One evening, a thick fog rolled in. You could barely see past the porch rail, but when I looked toward where the other cabin would be, there was a faint orange glow in the mist. Closer than it should have been. That night, I woke to the smell of candle wax, faint but real, hanging in the air of my bedroom. The next day, I went into town and asked around about the place. An older woman at the diner knew it. "That's the Jesper cabin," she said. "Ain't been lived in since the late 70s. Fellow used to light a candle in the window every night for his wife. She'd gone missing. He said it was so she could find her way home." She leaned closer. "She never did." That evening, I sat with the curtains drawn, telling myself I wouldn't look, but at 9:58 I was at the window, heart in my throat. 10 o'clock came, and the candle bloomed into life in the window across the ridge. I couldn't see the shadow this time, just the steady, impossible flame. I don't watch it anymore, but sometimes, without meaning to, I'll glance that way after dark, and when I do, I swear the candle is brighter than before, like it's burning for me now, not for her. Story 6. The footsteps on my roof. It started in late October, the kind of cold that bites a little harder at night and makes the house creak in ways you notice. I'd been waking around 2 in the morning for no reason, just an uneasy stirring. But that first night, I heard it. I knew it wasn't the wind. The sound was slow, deliberate footsteps. Not the quick scuttle of squirrels or raccoons, not the groan of wood shifting with temperature. These were heavy, measured steps, like boots on old boards. They started above my bedroom and moved toward the living room, paused, then crossed back again. I remember lying there, holding my breath, counting each one. 5 steps, a pause. 4 steps, another pause. After maybe 2 minutes, I grabbed my flashlight and eased out the front door. The second the door latch clicked, the footsteps stopped. I shined the light over the roofline, sweeping the beam along the gutters, the chimney, the pitch of the roof. Nothing. The night was too still for anyone to be moving fast enough to vanish without a sound. After a few minutes of staring into the cold air, I went back inside. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a big owl or something, but it came back. Not every night, but often enough. Always around 2, always that same slow pacing. I stopped going outside. The third time it happened, I just lay there listening until it faded. It was almost easier that way, pretending if I didn't interrupt it, it would leave me alone. One night in early November, I decided I'd watch instead. The footsteps started on schedule, and I slipped out of bed and into the living room. My skylight is small, set into the slant of the roof above the couch. I stood in the dark, heart hammering, staring up. At first, I just saw shadows, the faint blur of motion as something passed over the glass. Then it stopped directly above me. There was weight in it. You could feel it in the way the glass seemed to press inward just slightly. I could make out the outline of a figure, crouched, its head tilted down toward me. I couldn't see a face, just the darker shape of where a face should be, pressed close to the glass. I don't remember deciding to move, but I backed into the hall, turned on the light, and stayed there until the sound stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I pulled out the ladder and climbed onto the roof. The frost crunched under my boots, and my breath came out in pale bursts. That's when I saw them, muddy boot prints, clear as day. They started just above my bedroom, crossed to the skylight, and led toward the chimney. Then they stopped, right at the edge of the roof. No prints going back. It had rained 2 nights before. Whoever it was had been up there since. I told my neighbour, Earl, about it that afternoon. He frowned but didn't say much, just told me to keep an ear out, and went back to stacking his woodpile. Not exactly comforting. The nights after that, I started sleeping with a light on. The footsteps came less often, but when they did, they seemed slower, like whoever it was knew I was listening. Sometimes they'd linger in one spot for longer, just standing there, weight shifting slightly on the boards. The worst was the night I heard them climb down. The sound started as usual, but instead of fading, it moved toward the far corner of the roof. Then came the scrape of boots on the gutter, the faint thump of feet hitting the ground. I held my breath, straining to hear, and then there it was, the crunch of leaves in the yard, heading toward the tree line. I didn't go outside. A week later, I found something tucked into the corner of the porch rail, a small smooth stone with a hole worn through the middle. It wasn't there the day before. I didn't pick it up. By mid-November, the pattern had changed. The footsteps didn't always come at 2 anymore. Sometimes they came earlier, sometimes later, but always when the house was quiet. One night, I woke at 1:15 to the sound starting directly above the bedroom. No approach, just there. I could feel the vibration through the ceiling joists. That was when I nailed the skylight shut from the inside. Not that it would have done much if someone really wanted in, but it made me feel less exposed. Then came the first snow. I didn't hear anything that night, but in the morning, I stepped out to see the white surface of the roof marked in a strange pattern. Boot prints again, but this time they didn't follow any straight path. They wandered, small loops, circles, back and forth lines like pacing. Around the skylight, the snow was worn away completely. I stood there staring up at it, the cold numbing my fingers. Whoever was doing this wasn't just passing over my roof. They were spending time up there. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off, waiting. Hours passed, the silence so deep it felt like it was pressing on my ears. Then, sometime after 3, the sound began. But it wasn't footsteps this time. It was a slow, deliberate tapping on the glass of the skylight. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. When I finally worked up the nerve to move, I turned on every light in the house. 2 days later, I saw Earl again. I told him about the tapping, about the prints in the snow. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Don't wait up for it. Whatever's coming around, it'll come whether you're watching or not." I didn't sleep much after that. By December, the visits slowed. Weeks would go by without a sound, and I'd think maybe it was over. But then it would return, and each time it felt more deliberate, like it knew I was waiting for it. The last time I heard it was late in the month, just before Christmas. Snow covered the roof again. The night was still, and I'd been asleep for hours when the first step came. It was so heavy, I felt it in my chest. Step by step, it crossed the roof, paused over the skylight, and then moved to the chimney. There was a long silence. Then, from directly above me, 3 slow knocks on the roof. I didn't move. I didn't get up. The sound faded toward the far edge, and that was it. The next morning, I climbed up to look. The prints were there, leading to the chimney, then stopping at the edge again. I still don't know where they go after that. I'm not sure. I want to. Story 7. The voice under the floorboards. My neighbor asked me to check on her place while she was away. Said it casual at the mailbox, like she was asking me to bring in a package. She'd be gone a week, maybe 10 days if her sister's treatment ran long. "Just switch a light on here and there. Bring the paper in, you know." "I'd be grateful," she said, and I nodded because that's what you do when folks up here ask for small favors. Her name is Ruth, and she's lived on this ridge longer than me, longer than most. Her house is the kind that looks like it grew out of the hill. Low-slung porch, tin roof patched with a different kind of tin, wood stacked tight along the north wall. I'd seen her sit on that porch in all weathers, never seemed to get cold. It felt neighborly, the kind of thing that makes winter feel less empty. That first night, I walked over after dark to make it look lived in. The ridge carried a colder breath than usual, and the wind moved through the dead laurel like someone adjusting their weight in a chair. Ruth hadn't left many instructions. Key under the grey rock, front lamp to the right of the door. I let myself in and flicked the lamp on, watched that old yellow shade throw a halo onto a room tidy in a way that made sound feel out of place. I turned in a slow circle, checking that windows were latched, that the wood stove was cold and safe. It was on that little turning step, right foot over left, that I heard it. A voice, low and muffled, as if it were inside something and didn't want me to know. At first I thought radio, the kind old men keep running in barns for company. The sound wasn't words, not at the start, just the shape of speech. I stood still and it faded, and the house was back to being only house. I told myself it was the wind running over something, maybe through a bit of venting under the floor. But I knew the difference between air and words. Air wants to move freely, words try to get to you. I shut the lamp and went home, telling myself I'd come earlier the next evening, daylight making everything reasonable. Day 2, still light. The ridge was raw with wind, and the sky had that narrowed down winter look, everything pale blue and white, like a bruise. I opened Ruth's door and stood on the threshold a long moment, listening the way you do for water when you're lost in the woods. Nothing. Her place has that clean lemon oil smell older women like, and it hit me then how often I had smelled it on her, how close a person needs to be to recognize what their house smells like. I walked the rooms in daylight and it all made sense. The teeny kitchen with a microwave older than some people I know, the pantry with jars lined like soldiers, a bar of pink soap in a dish by the sink. Normal. I draped a sweater over a chair back and slid a pair of boots off-center by the door. Little touches to make it look like someone was in and out. When I turned to leave, I heard it again. Softer this time, like whoever it was had settled closer to the floor. I stepped back, slow. The voice hummed under the boards, an insect nest of syllables. When I got low and put my ear near the braided rug, it grew distinct in a way that made me forget to breathe. My own name. That's what I heard, whispered careful and close. It said my name like someone who'd been practicing the taste of it. I shot up so fast I went dizzy. The room swayed and the lampshade flickered in my vision as if there'd been a change in light. It came again. My name, in a voice that wasn't quite male or female, something flattened by wood. I told myself it could have been sound traveling, a television in a house further down the slope, or a pair of kids running a prank. But there are no houses down slope of Ruth's place. Only the old hollow and the creek that runs too low this time of year to make much noise. I backed toward the door, took my coat from the peg with clumsy hands, and stepped out onto the porch like the house had decided it was no longer a friendly place. I didn't lock the door. Not the lock I was worried about anyway. I tried to lay it out straight on paper that night at my kitchen table. What I heard, what it could be. I wrote ductwork and critters and pipeline under house, but nothing felt like it fit around the shape of a voice saying my name from inside Ruth's floor. I went out onto my porch and looked across the dark. The ridge gathers sound strange sometimes. You can yell at a dog a half-mile away and it'll come, or you can stand 20 feet from someone and not hear them unless you look at their mouth. But names are a different kind of sound. They stick to you and follow you back. The third night, I brought a flashlight and a plan. I had seen the crawlspace door at Ruth's, small, backside of the house. nearly lost behind a stack of old roofing. It was latched with a hook and eye, the kind anybody can lift. I told myself I'd look, that I'd see raccoon handprints in the dirt and find some shredded fiberglass from a nest, and then feel good about things. Inside, I turned on a different lamp, the corner one by the bookshelf. It should have made the room feel warmer than the ceiling lamp did, but it didn't. It threw this long oval of light across the floorboards and made the spaces between boards look like gaps in teeth. The whisper didn't come, not at first. I stood very still and counted, then moved and counted again. On the third slow circle of the room, I heard my name again, drawn longer this time, like someone seeing if a string would hold. I went straight out into the yard and around back before my nerve could break. I moved the stack of roofing, set each piece down as quietly as I could. The crawlspace door was swollen from damp and resisted at first. Then the wood gave, and I was looking at a black slot that breathed out a smell like wet dirt and cold metal. I put my light down, not too far. The beam caught. Dust in the air, and the joists ran left to right. You could see the pale undersides of the floorboards and the shreds of some older insulation falling in curls. A length of duct glinted. There was room enough under there to belly crawl if you had to, but I didn't have to. The ground was not smooth like I expected. It was rutted, as if someone had moved through the same place many times. I aimed my light along the rut. It disappeared into the shadows where the house widened. Then something moved. It wasn't big, a ripple more than anything, but it was a ripple that suggested deliberate motion and not wind. The crawlspace holds air heavy with the ground, and the smallest motion looks bigger in it. I held my breath and listened to my own heartbeat, loud enough that it felt like it might give me away to something that already knew me. "Hello," I said, before knowing I would. It came out too loud. The ripple stopped. The house above did not move, but a sound came back, low and certain, my name again. Not quite from the crawlspace, not quite from within the house, but from the seam between them. It said it like you might say, "Here," but with that shape of a question that knows its answer already. I swung the light away on instinct, as if I could hide. My hand found the door and pulled it shut, the latch caught, quick and clumsy. I stood in the yard with my mouth open like the night could use my breath. On the fourth day, I told myself I wouldn't go back. Ruth wouldn't know if I missed one night. But afternoon makes you brave falsely, and guilt does its own kind of pushing. I walked over at dusk with my coat open to prove I wasn't scared, and kept it open long enough that the cold got into my shirt. I didn't turn on any lamps. I stood leaning against the doorframe, letting the last of the day in. The house made that settling noise old houses make when the temperature changes, a mild shift like shoulders under a blanket. I waited in that nearly dark until my eyes adapted to the shape of the room. And there, threading through the thick quiet, came a whisper from the boards. It didn't say my name right away, like it had learned something about how to keep me in place. It murmured first, a meaningless roll of sound, then slid into two syllables that matched me. I felt a childish urge to answer, not with words but by moving, like it would be enough to stand directly over it and be counted. I did something an older, smarter version of me would not have. I knelt and put both hands flat to the floor and pressed my face down so the grain ran across my cheek. It was colder than it should have been. I could hear breath. Mine, yes, but a second one too, close to the boards as if a mouth were just under the seam. The voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It spoke like someone careful of being overheard. "I can hear you." That's what it said, not the words themselves but their shape. I got up so fast my knee cracked. The house, at that moment, felt like a thin skin on a drum. I went into town the next morning and asked Bobby at the hardware store about venting, about how sound can travel under a house. He told me you'll hear all kinds of things under there. Water lines singing, wind humming through a loose vent cap, critters that sound like men if you're alone enough. Sound plays tricks, he said, and his eyes did their best to mean it, but his voice was the kind of friendly that doesn't carry weight. Before I left, I was half turned at the bell when he said, "Ruth, keeping good?" Like he was asking me to answer more than that. I said she was with her sister and he nodded once, then looked past me at a display of brooms as if it might change the subject for us both. That evening, I told myself I'd bring a chair from my place and sit with the light on for an hour, just to prove a point to myself. Bring a book, drink a cup of tea, that kind of thing. I did none of it. I brought the chair and set it in the middle of the room, then I stood and didn't sit. The voice came soft when it came, like I'd promised it something. It said my name and then said, "Please." The second word didn't sound right in a way that made my skin tighten. It sounded like someone who had learned the word from hearing it shouted, not said. I put both hands on the back of the chair and leaned in till the wood edge bit my palm. "What do you want?" I asked before I knew I would. There was a pause that made me think of someone moving closer to the crack between boards. When it answered, it said, "Down." Not a full sentence, but it held one inside it. It wanted me down there. I did not go down there. I turned every lamp on and then every lamp off because the light made the whisper harder to find, and I didn't know if that helped or harmed me. When I finally left, the ridge had taken on that deep blue that feels like water. I locked the door without meaning to. It clicked sharp, then felt foolish because the thing I was locking against was in rather than out. Back at my place, I made noise for hours. Radio and kettle and the creak of every drawer I own opened and shut. That night, just after I put myself in bed like a child, I heard a faint sound under my own floor. Not a voice, not words. More like someone dragging the pad of a finger along the joist, testing it. I got up and turned the stereo on and let it play storm noises until morning. Ruth called on day 6 in a voice that tried not to be in a hospital. "You been keeping an eye?" she asked. I told her yes and added details that were true enough. The paper in, curtains set just so, the lamp on. I did not say anything about the voice. It wasn't a thing you could give to someone over the phone. "Hear anything?" she asked, casual. I said I heard the wind in the laurel. She said her sister slept a whole hour, as if she knew the right ratio of truth to offer back. On day 7, I took a spade and a headlamp and told myself I was going to look under that house for a nest, a burrow, a break in a vent that turns sound into speech the way a flute turns breath into song. When a thing asks you for 7 days, you begin to feel either obedient or ridiculous. I made the choice that felt least like surrender. The ground under the crawl space was colder than the air outside. Dirt holds its own season. I slid my shoulders past the opening and got myself onto my stomach and felt immediately how stupid a body can be, how soft. The headlamp made a narrow world and the house above made a low lid. My breath threw steam forward into my own light. The ruts I had seen before were deeper up close, and they weren't the animal kind. Animals make haphazard roads. These were careful, 2 parallel grooves pressed by elbows and toes, someone careful not to disturb the soil beyond. I followed them until the underbelly of the kitchen pressed the roof of the world down lower, and I had to turn my head sideways to keep moving. It was there, in the seam where the pantry above turned into the stove space, that I found the shape of what used to be access. Somebody had once cut a hole and then screwed it back in with non-matching wood. The screws were too new for the rest of it. Something about that made me feel both alone and watched. I lay there with my cheek to dirt and felt the faintest vibration in the joist. A length of ducting ran to my right, not connected to anything I could see, like a mouth that had forgotten its purpose. I pushed my fingers into the dirt ruts and felt darker soil under the packed top, as if the path had been wet more recently than the rest. The voice came then, from the seam, from ahead of me, from behind me. It used my name and then that "not right, please" again, and then another word I couldn't place because it was broken by wood. The headlamp threw its circle of light where the screws sunk into the patch. I counted them for something to do. There were 6. The third from the left had a smear of something that wasn't dirt. Oil, maybe, or candle wax. I reached forward, and when my finger touched the head of that screw, everything in me said, "Do not." So I did not. I backed out of there the way a person backs out after stepping too close to a drop-off, slow and keeping hands wide. I sat in the wet leaves behind Ruth's house and breathed like a church bell, big and slow. I thought about who all knew when Ruth would be gone. The postmaster knew because she held her mail. Bobby at the hardware store might. I knew. And whoever had been under there knew enough to say my name through wood. I stood looking at that crawlspace door and realized the latch was inside now. Not the way I had left it. I looked at my hands as if they could tell me how I'd done it, and my hands looked back like they were mine again. When Ruth came home, I went over the next afternoon with a basket I filled with what I had, which was eggs and apples and a jar of beans. Didn't want. She looked shrunken from being away, the kind of tired that you don't rest from just by lying down. We stood in her not quite the same doorway. She took the basket and then held onto it like it might tell her what to say. I told her about the papers and the lamps and not about the voice, but I think I said it without words because she went still and would not meet me. It was in the not meeting that I understood she had known there was a thing to hear in her floor and had asked me to keep notice anyway. I wanted to ask her if she ever looked under there, if she ever heard her own name. Instead, I said, "You let me know if you need anything." She nodded, a tiny tilt, and said, "Thank you." When I turned to go, she touched my sleeve, not holding, just the way you touch a dog to make sure it's really there, and let go like skin had told her the answer. I expected quiet after that, like whatever was said would be smoothed back into silence by living. 2 nights later, close to 2 in the morning, I woke to my own floor finding its voice. It started the way rain starts, a soft insistence that becomes something else. A whisper ran under my bed and along the wall, not words at first, then words, then my name said plain. I held myself still because something in the tone asked for stillness. The voice gave 3 short breaths and then said, "Down." I counted my own breaths and tried not to lose the count. After a time long enough to carry into a second one, a second sound came with it. A tiny scrape, like the pad of a thumb across old wood. I did not get up. I lay and waited for my house to decide whether to be a house or a mouth. In the morning, I looked in my crawlspace. I told myself it'd be better to see nothing than to think about everything. I found the same ruts pressed into my dirt that had been at Ruth's, 2 grooves and a careful path. The line ran toward my kitchen, right beneath where a previous owner had patched a section of plank around the sink. The screws were newer than they had any reason to be. The third from the left had a smear of wax. The air down there had a smell I couldn't place until later. A candle snuffed by fingers. Ruth and I don't talk about it. She waves from her porch, and I wave from mine. Sometimes I see her sitting with her feet braced as if waiting for something to pass through the boards. On some nights, I can see a glow low against her floor, like a lantern somewhere it shouldn't be. I don't go out walking after midnight anymore. Sometimes, just before I sleep, a gentle pressure runs along the underside of my house, the kind of touch that asks a question and then answers it. When I do sleep, I dream that someone is in my pantry counting screws. I wake and put my ear to the wall, and the wood is only wood again, stiff with cold and old stories. And when the house is quiet in that particular way it only gets in winter, the kind of quiet your blood sits inside and listens to, there is a moment before I get up when I think, If I lifted that patch and peered down into the dark, there'd be a candle burning in the dirt and a mouth near the boards that already knows what I'm going to say. I get up and make coffee and turn the radio onto a station that comes and goes with the weather. I do not turn the music high. I want to hear the quiet between songs. I want to know when the floor remembers my name. Story 8. The Stranger in My Garden. It was just before dawn when I saw him for the first time, a man standing in my garden like he belonged there, still as a post between the bean rows. The kitchen window gave me a perfect view, the pale light just enough to outline his shape. His head was tilted, not toward the house but toward the ground, like he was studying something important at his feet. I grabbed the flashlight from beside the coffee tin and went to the porch, moving quick before the part of me that knows better could catch up. By the time I stepped outside, he was gone. The soil was damp from a night mist. But there were no footprints, no bent leaves, no sign of anything heavier than a bird having passed through. The quiet was too complete, like the sound had been taken out of the morning. The next day, I found his answer waiting for me. One of the bean rows, straight as I'd planted it, had been undone. Every plant had been dug up and replanted in a perfect circle, stems leaning inward, roots combed and facing the center as if they were bowing to it. Whoever had done it had pressed the dirt back down with neat, flat palms. It didn't look vandalized. It looked arranged. I put the row back, my hands clumsy compared to the work I'd just undone. That night, I set my trail camera on the fence post, aimed it at the beans. After dark, the ridge went quiet in that way it does when even the creek decides to rest. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound, soft scraping, steady, patient, not footsteps, not animal rustling, the noise of something small moving, soil. I lay still and let it pass. In the morning, the beans were in 2 overlapping circles, roots of each pointing toward the shared center. The camera showed an empty garden at 10, a washed-out blur at 1:30, and nothing but black at 3. I moved the camera higher. The next night, the scraping came earlier, with it a faint cough, almost polite. I stayed inside. Morning brought something new. A ring of pebbles on my porch, each stone touching the next, one gap left at the top like a missing tooth. I swept them into a jar and without thinking said, "Thank you," aloud. I walked the fence line that afternoon. The gate was latched, the wire uncut, posts straight. Only the mulch looked wrong, lines of straw drawn inward toward where the circles had been. At the mailbox I told Earl. He listened, then said the ridge had its ways. "Some folks," he said, "set things down when the dark's the only time they can stand themselves." The next night I tried to keep watch, coffee in hand, porch light off. I made it until 1 before sleep found me. When I woke, I went to the garden without my flashlight. 12 plants stood in a perfect ring, 1 gap left, empty. I didn't think. I just planted the missing one. The air inside the ring felt warmer than the rest of the yard. After that, the circles stayed put. The beans grew, putting out small new leaves like nothing strange had happened at all. But some nights, I still woke to the soft scrape of soil being moved, sometimes in the garden, sometimes closer to the house. Once, the next morning, I found my scarecrow neatly dismantled on the bench, twine coiled tight beside it. Another time, a row of my own seeds had been planted outside the garden fence, each tucked into a little mound of fresh earth. One night I asked the dark, "Why the circle?" In the morning, 3 fat earthworms lay side by side on the flat stone by the gate. Another night I said, "What do you want?" And the next day, nothing in the garden had been touched at all. It rained heavy one Friday, the kind of rain that makes the ground breathe. That evening, I noticed the soil in the center of the bean circle had sunk a little, As if something had been taken out or placed in, I dug with my hands. 6 inches down, I found a loop of brittle twine. A little deeper, a scrap of thin cloth. Then my fingers closed around something small and smooth, a marble, milk white with a green ribbon inside. I put everything back the way I found it. The next morning, the circle was gone, beans back in their row. But on the porch, the ring of pebbles was there again, complete this time. In the garden, a second marble waited in the dirt, green brighter than the first, catching the light. I put it in the jar with the pebbles and left it there. Most nights now are quiet, but sometimes, in that thin space before dawn, I think I hear the slow, steady scrape of someone's hand in the soil, keeping a shape only they understand. I don't disturb it anymore. Whatever it is, it seems to be tending something. And on the stillest mornings when I look out the kitchen window, I swear I see a shape in the garden again, head bent toward the earth, as if listening for an answer.